Welcome to Stories Junction. Let's begin today's story. My name is Daniel, and if there's one lesson life has hammered into me, it's that responsibility doesn't guarantee smooth sailing. My wife, Claire, and I had a solid marriage. Nothing extraordinary, but nothing disastrous either. We had our share of arguments, like any couple, but we always found a way to patch things up. That is, until she brought up her brother, Miles. That single conversation flipped our world upside down. It was a quiet evening in our modest home in Portland when Claire approached me, her face etched with worry. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, twisting her hands together, and said Miles had been kicked out of his place in Seattle. He'd been crashing with friends, bouncing from one spare couch to the next, and now he was out of options. She wanted him to stay with us, just for a little while, she insisted, until he could stand on his own again. The second she said it, my answer was locked in. No, not a chance. Claire blinked, caught off guard. She'd expected me to agree, probably to keep the peace, but I wasn't about to roll out the welcome mat for chaos. Miles wasn't just unlucky. He was his own worst enemy. The guy threw money around like it grew on trees, chasing every shiny new fad without a thought for the consequences. This wasn't his first eviction, and I'd bet my last dollar it wouldn't be his last. Whenever he hit rock bottom, he'd play the humble card, but the minute cash landed in his pocket, it was back to reckless spending, bad decisions, and zero accountability. I laid it out for Claire plain and simple. If we let Miles in, he's not leaving in a few weeks. He's staying for good. I tried helping him before, offered advice, even lined up a gig once, but he never changed. The only time Miles shaped up was when he had no other choice, and living with us would take that away. Free rent, free food, and Claire smoothing over every mess he made? No way was I signing up for that. Claire stared at me, stunned. She couldn't believe I'd refuse her. It's just temporary, she pleaded. Family helps family, Daniel. Then the accusations started flying. Cold, selfish, heartless. She acted like I was committing some unforgivable sin by not letting her brother crash with us. But I didn't budge. I wasn't being cruel. I was being real. That's when the war began. Claire didn't drop it. The next few days turned icy. She barely spoke to me unless it was to guilt-trip me about Miles. When she wasn't freezing me out, she was sniping at me with little digs, passive-aggressive jabs, or exploding over nothing. I figured she'd wear herself out eventually, but a week later, she was still going strong. One night, I dragged myself home from work, bone-tired and dreading the tension waiting for me. The air in the house was thick, suffocating. As I stood in the doorway, I saw it clear as day. I could keep fighting this losing battle, or I could cave. In a moment of weakness I'd come to regret, I let out a sigh, looked at Claire, and muttered, "Fine, Miles can stay." Her whole demeanor flipped. The frost melted away, and suddenly she was beaming, wrapping her arms around me, planting kisses on my cheek. "Thank you, Dan," she said, her voice dripping with relief. It was like a switch had been flipped. But as she clung to me, I felt something else, a heavy, sinking dread in my gut. I just cracked open a door I wouldn't be able to shut. And I was right. When Miles first rolled into our place with a duffel bag and a lazy grin, I wasn't thrilled, but I hoped I'd misjudged him. For the first couple of days, it wasn't terrible. He kept to himself, mostly, and Claire was over the moon to have her brother close. I told myself if he was serious about getting back on track, he'd start job hunting soon. Maybe I'd been too hard on him, but that illusion didn't last. By the end of the week, the truth started creeping in. Every night, I'd come home from the office, and there was Miles, sprawled across my couch in the living room, feet propped up, scrolling his phone or glued to the TV. It didn't matter if I left at dawn or stumbled in late. He was always there, parked in the same spot. The fridge was a revolving door of missing food, and the sink was a growing pile of dirty dishes. He wasn't pitching in, not even the bare minimum. I tried playing nice at first, giving him the benefit of the doubt. "So, Miles," I said one evening, leaning against the doorway, "any luck on a job front?" He didn't even glance up from his phone, just smirked and said, "Why rush it?" Like the idea of working was some kind of joke. That hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't struggling to find a job. He didn't want one. I couldn't believe Miles had the nerve to say it. Why rush it? Like mooching off us was some clever life hack. For a second, I thought maybe he just needed a nudge, a little push to get moving. So I swallowed my frustration and tried to help. I called in a favor with a buddy at a warehouse downtown. Nothing glamorous, just a steady gig to get him started. I even floated the idea of an entry-level spot at my own firm, a small logistics company I'd been with for years. I handed him the leads, thinking he'd at least pretend to care. Miles didn't even flinch. He laughed, actually laughed, and waved me off. Those jobs? Come on, Dan, they're not my level. I've got bigger things brewing. Bigger things? All I saw was a guy who hadn't left my couch in days, unless it was to grab another beer from my fridge. There was no grand plan, no hustle, just a flimsy excuse wrapped in arrogance. Meanwhile, his habits didn't let up. He wasn't pulling in a cent, but somehow he was always flush enough for pizza deliveries, a new pair of overpriced headphones, or whatever gadget caught his eye online. It didn't take a genius to figure out where the money was coming from. One night, I caught Claire slipping him a couple of 20s from her purse. When I asked her about it later, she brushed it off. He just needed a little something to tide him over, she said, like I was the bad guy for even questioning it. Tide him over? I shot back. Claire, he's turning down jobs left and right. What's he tiding over to? She rolled her eyes and huffed. Give him a break, Dan. He's not wired like you. He's got his own path. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, like I was the one out of line for expecting her grown brother to act like an adult. That's when it clicked. Claire wasn't just helping Miles. She was propping him up, making excuses for every lazy choice he made. I tried reasoning with her, laying out the facts. He wasn't looking for work, he was draining us, and she was enabling it. But she wouldn't hear it. You're too hard on him, she'd snap. Or he's family, not some stranger off the street. The more I pushed, the more she dug in, and the rift between us grew. One morning, I was at the dining table, nursing a black coffee and skimming emails, trying to brace myself for another day of this mess. Claire was in the kitchen, whistling some tune like everything was fine, while Miles lounged in his usual spot, thumbing through his phone. It was the same old scene, until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, Miles stood up and sauntered over to me, hands shoved in his pockets. No small talk, no build-up. He just looked down at me and said, I need your debit card for something. I froze, coffee halfway to my mouth. For what? I asked, keeping my voice even. He sighed, loud and dramatic, like I was inconveniencing him. It's urgent, okay? I'll square it up later. Urgent, right? I set my mug down and gave him a dry chuckle. Miles, you don't have a job. How are you squaring anything up? His laid-back vibe vanished. He straightened up, eyes narrowing. Look, man, don't turn this into a thing. Just help me out. It wasn't a request. It was a demand like I owed him. I shook my head, calm but firm. No. He glared at me, then swung his gaze to Claire, waiting for her to swoop in. And she did. She stormed out of the kitchen, hands on her hips, face flushed with anger. Are you kidding me, Daniel? She barked. It's just a card. Why are you being like this? I turned to her, stunned. You think I should just hand it over? No questions asked because he says it's urgent. She scoffed, loud and bitter. What? You don't trust him now? He's my brother. Her words hung there, sharp and accusing, but I didn't bite back. I didn't have to. The truth was screaming loud enough. Then it happened. In one quick, wild move, Claire snatched my coffee mug off the table and hurled it at me. The hot liquid hit me square in the chest, soaking my shirt and stinging my skin. I didn't flinch, didn't yell, just sat there, letting the burn settle in. Claire's eyes widened for a split second, like she'd shocked herself, but she doubled down fast. Arms crossed, chin up, she spat. You're unbelievable, Daniel. Everything's always got to be your way, doesn't it? You think you're above us. I wiped my face with my sleeve, saying nothing. Something inside me snapped. Not anger, not even hurt, just a cold, final clarity. I was done. I didn't argue, didn't fire back. I just sat there, letting her words bounce off me, because I knew what came next. Later that day, after they both left, Claire probably shopping, Miles off sponging somewhere else, I made my move. I went to the bedroom, grabbed a backpack, and stuffed it with the essentials. Clothes, my ID, a few work files, my charger. The rest? They could have it. I wasn't coming back. Before I walked out, I grabbed a sticky note from the counter and scribbled, I'm out. You and Miles need to leave. I slapped it on the table next to Claire's cold coffee cup and headed for the door. I could picture them coming home, finding the note, and laughing it off. Claire would roll her eyes, call it another one of my dramatic fits, convinced I'd slink back in a day or two with my tail between my legs. She'd probably think a few sweet words over the phone would reel me in. But this wasn't a bluff. This was the end. The moment I stepped into my new place, a cramped but quiet rental across town, I didn't waste time. I pulled out my laptop and got to work. First stop, my bank accounts. Claire had access to everything. Joint cards, auto transfers to her personal account, the works. I'd been too trusting, too lenient, and now it was time to fix that. One by one, I locked her out, froze the accounts she could tap, canceled the card she used, cut off the steady drip of cash she'd taken for granted. By the time I was done, her free ride was over. She didn't even know it yet. I leaned back on the stiff couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence was deafening, but it felt right. No more coming home to Miles sprawled out like he owned the place. No more Claire's guilt trips echoing in my ears. I'd drawn a line, and for once I was sticking to it. The house they were still in? That was the next domino to fall. It wasn't mine, not technically. Years ago, I'd been smart enough to let my company buy it, a perk of my job. The logistics firm I worked for was tied up in a family trust my dad had set up, registered somewhere overseas. As long as I lived there, Claire had a roof. But now that I was gone, the company could reclaim it. She had no idea what was coming. She wasn't just losing me. She was losing everything she'd built her life on. Claire didn't reach out that first night or the next. I figured she was playing her usual game, silence as punishment, waiting for me to crack. But then the bank changes hit. Her first text came 3 days later, and it wasn't an olive branch. It was a tirade. "You're a coward, Daniel. Cutting me off like this? You'll pay for it." No apology, no hint of regret, just venom. I read it, deleted it, and moved on. She didn't miss me. She missed the money. Less than a week later, the real storm landed. I had a lawyer draw up divorce papers and sent them her way, along with an eviction notice from the company. Word got back to me through a mutual friend. Claire laughed when she saw them, tossed the papers on the counter like they were junk mail, smirking to Miles. He's bluffing again. She thought I'd cave, that I couldn't follow through. She didn't know how far she'd push me. But reality doesn't bend for denial. The eviction deadline came and went. No extensions, no second chances. The company sent a crew to the house, and Claire and Miles were out, forced to grab what they could carry and hit the street. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard she fought it until the end, yelling at the movers like they backed down. They didn't. Neither did I. That's when the fallout really kicked in. With no cash flow and no place to crash, Claire started scrambling. She pawned a necklace I'd given her years ago, then some earrings, scraping by on whatever she could sell. Miles, of course, didn't lift a finger, still acting like the world owed him a living. They bounced between cheap motels and friends' couches, but the handouts dried up fast. People get tired of leeches. Then Claire made her last play. She dragged me to court, convinced she'd walk away with a chunk of my money. She'd always assumed I was sitting on a fortune, half of which she thought was hers by right. But she didn't understand how things worked. On paper, I was broke. The house belonged to the trust. My savings were locked in corporate accounts she couldn't touch, and my salary was just enough to look modest. It wasn't luck. It was strategy, set up long before she turned on me. The judge took one look at the numbers and shut her down. No settlement, no payout, just a stack of legal bills she couldn't afford. For the first time, Claire had to face the mess she'd made. No safety net, no one to bail her out. She and Miles were on their own, and I was finally free. But she wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. A couple of weeks after the court ruling, I was settling into my routine at the office. It was a Thursday morning, gray and rainy, when my door flew open. My assistant, Jen, was shouting something about she wouldn't stop, but it was too late. Claire was already inside. She looked rougher than I'd ever seen her. Hair messy, eyes red, clothes wrinkled. Before I could say a word, she dropped to her knees in the middle of the room. "Daniel, please," she sobbed, tears streaking her face. "I've got nowhere to go, no one else. I messed up. I know I did, but don't do this. Remember us, what we had." Her voice cracked, hands trembling as she reached out. Don't throw it all away. I leaned back in my chair, watching her. There was no fire left in me. No anger, no pity, just a flat, empty calm. You lost me the day you picked Miles over me, I said, my tone steady. Throwing coffee at me was bad enough, but taking me to court? That sealed it. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. She knew I was right. I hit the intercom. Security. 2 guards stepped in, and Claire's breath hitched. Daniel, no, please, she whispered, but I didn't budge. They hauled her up, her eyes darting between me and the door. She didn't fight, just let them lead her out. At the threshold, she turned back, regret carved into her face. Then the door shut, and she was gone. Looking back, I can't say I didn't see the signs. They were there from the start, flickering like warning lights I chose to ignore. I wanted to believe Claire, the woman I'd vowed to build a life with, would put us first. But if there's one thing this mess taught me, it's that you can't outrun red flags. Claire had always had a soft spot for Miles, always made excuses for him, but I told myself it was just sisterly loyalty. I figured she'd set boundaries eventually. I was dead wrong. The moment she chucked that coffee at me, over a grown man who wouldn't lift a finger for himself, that's when it hit me. I'd never been her priority. It wasn't just the burn of the liquid on my skin. It was the sting of realizing where I stood. If your partner picks someone else over you, don't kid yourself. It's a neon sign they'll do it again. And Claire did, over and over, until I couldn't unsee it. Miles wasn't just a freeloader. He was a black hole. Lazy doesn't even cover it. He was entitled, rejecting every chance I threw his way like it was beneath him. Bigger things brewing, he'd say, but the only thing brewing was my resentment. He expected the world to hand him everything, money, shelter, a free pass, without breaking a sweat. But the real poison wasn't Miles. It was Claire. She didn't just let him slide. She cheered him on, bankrolled his delusions, and turned on me when I wouldn't play along. That's the trap with enabling. It doesn't just ruin the leech, it rots everything around them. My home became a war zone, and I was the enemy for daring to say no. Here's a truth people don't face until it's too late. Protect your money like your life depends on it. Love and trust sound nice, but when it all falls apart, cash turns into a battlefield. If I hadn't set things up the way I did, house in the company's name, assets tucked away in trusts, Claire would have bled me dry. She thought she'd waltz in a court and claim half of our life, but she didn't know the game. Legally, I had nothing she could touch. Some might call that ruthless, but tell me this. Was she thinking about love when she tried to gut me? Plan ahead, because the person you trust today could be the one tearing you down tomorrow. And the biggest lesson of all? Respect is the bedrock. Lose it, and you've lost everything. Claire didn't just cross a line when she threw that coffee. She'd been chipping away at me for months, brushing off my concerns, mocking my stance, siding with Miles at every turn. That was the real betrayal. Marriage can weather a lot, but once respect's gone, it's over. The coffee was just the moment I stopped pretending otherwise. When it's done, you've got to walk away, no looking back. After Claire's scene in my office, I didn't hear from her again. No more calls, no texts, no desperate voicemails. Maybe she finally got it, or maybe she was just plotting her next move. Either way, I was out of it. Word trickled back through old friends. She and Miles were still scraping by, bouncing from one temporary fix to another. She'd sold off more of her stuff, pawned anything shiny to keep them afloat. Miles? Still the same, leeching off whoever'd let him. I didn't care enough to dig deeper. They weren't my burden anymore. I settled into my new life, smaller, simpler but mine. The rental wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with peeling paint and a view of a parking lot. But it was quiet. No one raiding my fridge, no one guilting me into handouts. Work kept me busy, and for the first time in years, I felt steady. I dodged a bullet, maybe a whole clip, and I wasn't about to forget it. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, walking away, cutting them off, letting the house go. I don't. Regrets for people who didn't learn anything, and I learned plenty. I could have stayed, kept fighting for a marriage that was already dead, but what for? To prove a point? To save Claire from herself? She made her choices, and I made mine. That's how it works. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone stuck in a mess like mine, it's this: don't wait for the breaking point to hit you in the face. The signs are there early. Watch for them. A partner who picks someone else over you, a freeloader who drags everyone down, a life built on shaky ground. It's all screaming at you to get out. And when you do, don't just walk away, run. Protect what's yours, hold your line, and never let anyone strip you down to nothing. I got out. Barely. But I made it. So where are Claire and Miles now? Truth is, I don't know, and I don't want to. Maybe Claire's out there kicking herself, replaying every wrong turn she made. Maybe she's still pointing fingers, blaming me for the rubble of her life. Miles might have finally stumbled into some kind of hustle, or more likely, latched onto another sucker willing to carry him. It doesn't matter. They're ghosts to me now, shadows I've left behind. My world's smaller, quieter, and I like it that way. I've had time to sift through the wreckage, to pick apart what went wrong. It's not about pinning blame. There's enough of that to go around. It's about seeing the truth I dodged for too long. Claire and I weren't doomed from the start, but we were cracked, and I ignored the fractures. I thought love and commitment could plaster over anything. Her loyalty to Miles, her willingness to excuse him, my own stubborn hope. But cracks don't heal if you keep prying them open. She chose him over me again and again until the whole thing collapsed. People romanticize sticking it out, fighting for what you had. I get it. There's something noble in the idea. But there's a line between fighting and fooling yourself, and I crossed it too many times. Staying would have meant surrendering everything. My peace, my money, my self-respect, just to prop up a lie. Walking away wasn't weakness. It was survival. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. I'm not bitter, though. Not anymore. Anger's a heavy load, and I've dropped it. Claire and Miles taught me more than I ever wanted to learn. I'm grateful for that, in a twisted way. They showed me what happens when you let a parasite in, how it festers, spreads, and pulls everyone down with it. Miles wasn't the real villain. He was just the spark. Claire fanned the flames, and I stood there too long watching it burn. Lesson learned. Don't invite chaos through your door, and don't bank on someone else to shut it. Financially, I'm still standing because I planned for the worst. That trust, the company-owned house, it wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. Claire thought she'd cash out, but she didn't know the rules. I'd seen enough horror stories. Divorces where one side gets cleaned out because they didn't think ahead. I wasn't about to be that guy. Call it cold if you want, but it's not about hiding money. It's about guarding what you've built. Life's messy, and love doesn't pay the bills when it sours. Respect, though, that's the real currency. Claire torched ours long before the coffee hit my chest. Every time she dismissed me, every time she sided with Miles, she chipped away at it. That mug was just the final swing. You can rebuild a lot, trust, even love, but once respect's gone, there's no foundation left. I stayed too long hoping it'd come back, but you can't force what's already dead. When it's over, you've got to walk, head high, and not look back. My life's different now. The rental's no palace, faded walls, a leaky faucet I keep meaning to fix, but it's mine. Work steady, friends check in, and I've got space to breathe. I don't miss the old house, the old fights, the old me who bent too far to keep the peace. I'm not proud of everything I did, but I'm not ashamed either. I got out when I had to, and that's enough. If this story sounds familiar, if you're staring down your own Miles, your own Claire, listen up. Don't wait for the coffee to fly. The warnings are there. A partner who picks someone else, a freeloader draining your life, a setup that's crumbling under you. See it for what it is and act. Protect your money, your space, your dignity. Don't let anyone, family or not, suck you dry while they coast. And if respect's gone, don't stick around to mourn it. Get out and build something new. I'm not here to preach, just to pass on what I've learned the hard way. Share this if it hits home, if you know someone teetering on the edge of the same trap. There's a lot of Daniels out there, still thinking they can fix what's already broken. Maybe they'll see this and save themselves some scars. Me? I've got mine, but they're healing. I made it through. You can too.